Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you again to our lecture series on the United States in World Affairs. I'm Klaus Lares and I'm the Richard M. Krasner Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. As always, I would like to thank Richard Krasner and the sponsors behind him for supporting this lecture series, as well as our ambassadors for Forum very generously. In a few days' time, the lecture today will be available on our YouTube channel, and as you know, all the previous talks and lectures by scholars and ambassadors are also available on the YouTube channel. Please don't hesitate to watch them and to watch them as often as possible, please. Today, it is a particular great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Warren Kimball to Chapel Hill. I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to Warren's wife, Sally. Warren Kimball is a distinguished historian with a very wide-ranging interest. He is not only America's foremost expert on Franklin Roosevelt and the Second World War. He is also about to publish a history of the United States Tennis Association. And he has just come back from a visit to Moscow, which he will tell us about very shortly. Warren is a Robert Tree Professor of History Emeritus from Rutgers University, where he taught for 32 years. He also was Pitt Professor at Cambridge University in 87-88 and Visiting Distinguished Professor at the Citadel in 2002 and 2004. Warren held 2 fellowships at Corpus Christi College, and he was a Churchill Archive Fellow both at Cambridge University in the UK. Warren now lives on Seabrook Island in South Carolina, and that sounds like a very nice place to live. Among Warren Kimball's many publications are Forged in War, Roosevelt, Churchill and the Second World War, then The Juggler, Franklin Roosevelt as Wartime Statesman, as well as books on the Morgenthau Plan for Germany and the origins of Lend-Lease. Warren also edited the massive 3-volume correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt. It's in 3 volumes, makes very good reading, but you take a little while to actually get through it. And it's called The Complete Correspondence. His over 50 essays on Churchill, Roosevelt and the era of the Second World War have found a very wide readership among both scholars and the general public. Most recently in a published collection of co-edited essays, and that collection of essays is entitled FDR's World, War, Peace and Legacies, published in 2008. Warren is an academic advisor to the Churchill Center and senior editor for the Churchill journal Finest Hour. He chaired and served on the State Department's Historical Advisory Committee from 1990 to 2003, and he was also chair of the Secretary of State's Review Panel on the Historical Office from 2008 to 2009. He has just completed the almost final chapter of his book on the institutional history of the American Tennis Association. It is a great pleasure to have Warren Kimball here with us today. Today, Warren will first inform us briefly about the state of the history profession and the archival situation in Russia, and as I said, he has just come back from Moscow. And then he will talk to us about nuclear weapons, Roosevelt, Churchill and the transition to the Cold War world. That is of course all about dead white old man, but it still is very interesting indeed, and we can very much look forward to a talk by one of America's leading international historians. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure and honor to present to you Professor Warren Kimball.
Doing? Good to be here. Amidst the gloom in late 1941 that was created by the uncertainty on the Russian front, by German occupation of most of Europe, by the stalemate after the British stalemate with Rommel in North Africa, and by the deteriorating political situation in the Pacific, there was no reason to imagine that what seemed a small footnote in the correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt would develop into a force that seemed to have potential for geopolitical leverage beyond their wildest dreams. It began with a most secret paper written by 2 German scientists who had fled to England to get away from Hitler. That paper quickly persuaded the British government to set up a project labeled curiously Maud, after a nurse who had cared for the Danish atomic scientist Niels Bohr. It's even more ironic because Churchill thought Niels Bohr was a political naive and dismissed his ideas, so the Maud thing was doubly funny. Anyway, persuaded the British government who had studied the paper that they needed to do something. And what they did was they set up the Maud Project, if you will, because the British concluded, scientists who looked at it, that a nuclear fission bomb made from uranium would work, and that it would likely lead to decisive results in the war, and that it could be built by the end of 1943. They passed this Maud report to FDR, and that galvanized his science advisors. So, finally awakened to the possibility that the Germans were working on an atomic bomb, FDR proposed in October 41, before the United States is in the war, in a letter addressed Dear Winston, that they correspond or converse concerning the subject which is under study by your Maud Committee. And Churchill agreed. Of course, that was the atomic bomb. Time, strategic bombing, and sabotage happily ensured that the Germans would not succeed in their attempt to develop an atomic bomb. An Anglo-American scientific success came too late for it to be used against Germany, but two were dropped on Japan, seeming to shorten the war. We don't want to get into that argument, that's another question. But before that weapon could make its dark appearance over Nagasaki and Hiroshima, a war had to be fought. I do have a little footnote that's worth mentioning here because I find it curious. In 1924, Churchill wrote this wonderfully prescient sentence. He had no idea about the science. Might not a bomb, no bigger than an orange, atomic bomb was bigger than an orange, be found to possess a secret power to destroy a whole block of buildings, nay, to concentrate the force of 1,000 tons of cordite and blast a township at a stroke? What caused him to pen that remarkable statement in 1924, but there it was. Actually, it was Einstein, as you probably know, who told Roosevelt that the Germans were working on a nuclear weapon, or on an atomic weapon, and that he needed to consider that. And the reason Einstein was concerned is because the Germans had stopped exporting uranium once they took Czechoslovakia, and the Czechs had a lot of uranium, so he just cut it off. But anyway, that was a footnote, if you will. In June 42, with the United States finally fighting in the war, Churchill came over for his third meeting with Roosevelt. At those talks, they were named Argonaut, which was pretty cool because they were world travelers, and that one was when Churchill flew over in a seaplane, a 26-hour flight from England on the seaplane. And I presume it was unheated because most of the planes that flew at supposedly high altitudes back then didn't have any heat. Anyway, it was still quicker than by warship. He met, as they frequently did, at Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, and that seems to have been a pattern. Nobody ever said it, but it was a pattern when they met at Hyde Park. That's when they talked about the atomic project, the Manhattan Project, or Maud, whatever you want to say. It's always worth picking up a little bit from Daisy Suckley, that's Roosevelt's cousin, describing these various meetings. And she never talked about policy. It's not clear that she knew anything about policy, although she knew a little. Anyway, at 4 we drove over to the cottage. That was Top Cottage. This is Daisy. George, staff, soon came in with supplies for tea. We brought out a card table and put iced tea, sandwiches, and some cookies on it. Another table he had scotch and soda. After all, it was Churchill. Conversation was a little slow. Everyone sits around waiting for the P and Mr. C to speak. Must be quite a strain on them both. The P said I could take some pictures. The PM turned right around in his chair and smiled for me. And she just says, these two men face a horrible problem of deciding where the United Nations should attack. The different heads of the armies and navies disagree about it. It's rare that she seems to know what's going on, but she did. Anyway, tea talk aside, their discussions focused on tube alloys, which was what they were now calling the atomic bomb project. Churchill expressed concern about German research at a time when the Brits couldn't conduct much research because of heavy German bombings over England. 2 months later, the famous Manhattan Project began. The two concurred on unrestricted sharing of the information. But that argument was not reduced to writing. As the British ruefully learned, that allowed the Americans in charge of the project to pretend to be, if you will, or pretend to be ignorant of the sharing policy. Neither Churchill nor Roosevelt could plug into their strategic or political equations what happened at the University of Chicago 6 months later in December 42. On that date, scientists induced a chain reaction. The atomic bomb had been proven possible, but not so American sharing, Anglo-American sharing. From the outset, British officials complained to Churchill that the Americans were keeping them in the dark. Churchill raised the matter with Hopkins, saying, "Do you remember our conversation about that very secret matter? I should be grateful for some news about this, as at present the American War Department is asking us to keep them informed about our experiments, while refusing altogether any information about theirs." When Churchill and Roosevelt met in Washington in May 43, they continued the increasingly vigorous debate about sharing. Ready to put pressure on FDR, Churchill arrived in Washington with studies on showing the feasibility of an independent British atomic bomb project. That came in response to a number of Roosevelt's advisors who opposed revealing atomic secrets to the British despite early promises. U.S. government officials who would return to jobs in big business after the war were eager to maintain control over the commercial aspects of atomic energy. The director of Office of Scientific Research and Development told Hopkins that the adopted policy that these officials had adopted, was to provide information to those in the USA and Great Britain who need it and can use it now in the furtherance of the war effort. Information would not be provided to those who wish it either because of general interest or because of its application to non-war or post-war matters. To do so would decrease security without advancing the war effort. Kind of a hint of what we later come to call atomic diplomacy. Confronted by the Prime Minister, FDR agreed with obvious reluctance to live up to earlier promises. Yet, by the time they met again, the next meeting in August in Quebec, the commitment had not been fulfilled. This time they met again in Hyde Park. Once again, Daisy Suckley describes Mr. C ate 1.5 hot dogs and had a special little ice pail for his scotch. You can just see it. He's a strange-looking man, she said. Fat and round, his clothes bunched up on him, practically no hair on his head, and he wore a huge 10-gallon hat. He went to the swimming pool afterwards. Mrs. R came and made a dive and a splash or two. The PM decided to go in too. In a pair of shorts, he looked exactly like a Cupid. You know, a Cupid doll from the carnival? The PM, he made a good dive in, soon came out, wrapped a large wool blanket around him, and sat down to talk to FDR. So amidst hot dogs and swimming expeditions, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed for the third time that the U.S. would share its atomic research with Great Britain, and no one else. This Quebec Hyde Park Agreement of August 43, which was in writing, required mutual consent to use an atomic bomb or to pass on any information to about tube alloys to third parties, while Britain and the United States would have full and effective collaboration. Whether or not Stalin learned of that agreement is uncertain. It is certain that the U.S. Congress knew nothing about it until 1947. One historian diplomat, a man named Robin Edmonds, said, "There was much fog on all sides. The essence of the transatlantic difference was that whereas the Americans perceived the British as seeking to cash in cheaply on an immense American enterprise, the British perceived the Americans as seeking to establish military and industrial monopoly in the atomic field." When Churchill's personal science advisor, Lord Charwell, told the Americans that Britain viewed the bomb primarily as a means of restraining the Soviets, Bush interpreted FDR's anodyne response. Roosevelt said, nodded as he always did, to mean that the president was amazed, because that's what Bush wanted to be. And then he found Charwell's remarks astounding. They all failed to heed Eleanor Roosevelt's warning that Roosevelt always left visitors thinking he had agreed with them. And that was frequently a mistake. Anyway, the Quebec Hyde Park Agreement ended the quarreling over Anglo-American atomic collaboration for the remainder of the war. It also included the Canadians, since they were providing the uranium. But that was all they were providing. They weren't getting atomic information, really. Perhaps most revealing of all about this agreement is Churchill's minute that he sent to Cabinet after the agreement. He said, "I am absolutely sure we cannot get any better terms by ourselves than are set forth in my secret agreement with the President. It may be that in after years this will be judged to have been too confiding on our part. Only those who know the circumstances and moods prevailing beneath the presidential level will be able to understand why I have made this agreement." He could have called Vannevar Bush or James Conant by name. "There's nothing more to do now but carry on with it and give the utmost aid. Our association with the United States must be permanent, and I have no fear that they will maltreat us or cheat us." But there was much more than just cooperation on the table. Just before Roosevelt and Churchill met that autumn, they got the next autumn, 1944, again at Quebec, they got together at Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, so you know what they're going to talk about. They agreed to maintain the Anglo-American monopoly over the bomb. But that meeting followed an appeal from Niels Bohr, who I mentioned earlier, the Danish physicist and atomic scientist, who had pleaded with both the President and the Prime Minister to disclose the atomic secret to the world, lest it poison post-war relationships. Although Bohr's proposal fell afoul of now discredited suspicions that he had leaked information to the Soviet Union, there were advisors in both the British and American governments, Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, and Lord Charles, Churchill's scientific advisor, who found merit in some sort of internationalization of the bomb. But FDR and Churchill were having none of it. Yet, why keep the atomic bomb secret from the USSR? Roosevelt knew, at least by September 1943, that Soviet espionage had penetrated the Manhattan Project. Now, he didn't know how much the Soviets knew, and it's pretty clear what they knew was about the project, but not the science. But nonetheless, he knew they knew. But he didn't bring up the subject with Stalin. Why not? Perhaps comedians Abbott and Costello, or maybe it was the Marx Brothers, I'm not sure which, asked the question the right way. Did he know that they knew, that he knew, that they knew, that he knew, that you can go on forever with that roundabout thought. It's hilarious by comedians. I'm not sure it's hilarious when politicians do it. Anyway, Churchill in his war memoir claimed to be certain, that's his word, certain, that Stalin did not have, quote, special knowledge about the vast process of research for the bomb. Special knowledge, vast process of research, to me means he knew Stalin knew about the bomb project, but didn't have the science, which I think is a plausible situation. Anyway, those words probably were chosen at the behest of British intelligence, which, when Churchill wrote his memoirs, they made him take out all the information about the ultra-secret, the code-breaking secrets, and I'm sure they did the same thing for anything about nuclear stuff. There's no mention of those nuclear stuff in Churchill's memoir. Possibly Roosevelt wished to maintain the image of secrecy, lest Stalin demand access, full access, to the science. Perhaps the president was reluctant to brag about something that hadn't been tested, and about which his unsophisticated advisors remained skeptical. After all, in a world where the USA was jockeying for the USSR for position, false bravado could weaken his bargaining strength. Another part of the answer may be, I think this one is likely, like most non-scientists, FDR did not comprehend the revolutionary potential of nuclear weapons. His key scientific advisor on atomic energy, James Conant, believed FDR had only fleeting interest in the atom, and that the program never got very far past the threshold of his consciousness. That's utter nonsense. as you'll see some other things FDR says. But you can see why Conant would say, because Roosevelt didn't sit around and discuss it with him. He, meaning Roosevelt, really had no idea of the enormous importance of our atomic secrets. A number of military experts tended to see the bomb as nothing more than just a bigger bang. And it appears that Churchill and Stalin were similarly ignorant. Even the father of the bomb, scientist Robert Oppenheimer, dismissed as lunacy fears expressed by other scientists that radiation would have a long-term, long-range, lethal effect. Churchill told Niels Bohr to stop worrying. After all, this new bomb is just going to be bigger than our present bombs, and it involves no difference in the principles of war. As for Stalin, he took a personal interest in atomic bomb research, but at the same time, his scientists assured him that development of such a weapon would take 10 to 20 years. And there is a vast difference between knowledge of a research program and a working weapon. Whatever the varying weight of the contributing factors, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to another aide-memoire that flatly rejected any international agreement regarding control and use of tube alloys, the atomic bomb. They agreed to use the bomb on Japan, but only after, quote, mature consideration, a phrase that suggests, however, that they had a perception that it was something a little bit more than just a bigger bomb. Hard to tell. Certainly, both had demonstrated the ability to think beyond the simplistic notion that weapons had no ethical or moral questions attached. But there was no reason to do so until the weapon was tested, and FDR never crossed bridges until he came. There's some evidence that he mused about dropping a demonstration bomb to convince the enemy to surrender, Japanese, but at no time before Roosevelt's death did a top-level American leader seek to avoid the use of the A-bomb. Churchill didn't discuss the decision with his cabinet or chiefs of staff, writing in his war memoir that there was never a moment's discussion of whether the atomic bomb should be used or not. After Roosevelt's death, Churchill rather casually, according to observers, initialed a minute telling British officials to go along with what the Americans decided. Although maybe that's a way to escape culpability, I don't know. As for the Russians, rather, the easy answer is that the president was waiting for the right moment, when he could confront the Soviet Union with the new super weapon and gain effective political leverage. Was Roosevelt first practitioner of atomic diplomacy? Do we now have Roosevelt Cold Warrior? I think not. How could you reconcile that caution with his consistent and persistent policy, till the day he died, of trusting the Soviets in the hope of convincing them that the United States could be trusted by the Soviet Union? The likely answer is Roosevelt held back because the atomic bomb might work and might not. And Franklin Roosevelt was firmly rooted in the practical present. He knew that Stalin had intelligence on the bomb project, so there was no secret. To tell the Soviets and then refuse to share the technical information would not quiet any of Stalin's suspicions and could lead to an open argument. So why make a decision until the decision had to be made? And there were so many other decisions to be made about the post-war world. Churchill was enigmatic. Rarely did he show any compunctions about having used the bomb. Although in his second ministry, about which Klaus Laritz has written brilliantly, he expressed deep concern and fear, true fear, about the hydrogen bomb, saying that mankind was as far from the atomic age as the atom bomb was from the bow and arrow. In other words, the distance between atomic weapons and thermonuclear weapons was so staggering that he changed his opinion. Those, by the way, were fears that Dwight Eisenhower, the president, firmly and rather contemptuously dismissed. Churchill's expressed horror about the effects of H-bomb radiation lends credence to the argument that in 1945 he also saw the atomic bomb as something more than a bigger bang. February 1945, after the Yalta Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt met briefly aboard ship in the harbor outside Alexandria, Egypt. FDR had just concluded a meeting with Ibn Saud, who seemed only interested in penicillin. He died of syphilis. So he was only interested in penicillin, not solving the Israeli problem or the Palestinian problem or anything else, or even talking about oil. Oh, that new medicine. Anyway, crazy. FDR had just concluded a meeting with him and other Middle Eastern potentates. Churchill had come back from a quick visit from Greece to wave the flag lest Middle East leaders think Britain was abdicating its role in that part of the world. According to Churchill's own record, he read the Americans a proposal for Britain to develop its own atom bomb after the war, and FDR made no objection of any kind. Though he did comment that thoughts about using atomic energy for commercial purposes had receded. Those are Churchill's words about Roosevelt. Roosevelt also pointed to September 1945 for the first important trials of the atomic bomb. So he saw it coming, and coming fairly quick, but later than it did. That was their last discussion about the bomb. And in fact, the Trinity, the successful Trinity explosion, fusion, came 3 months later in Alamogordo. Okay. The impossible dream of an Anglo-American and then an American atomic monopoly was perhaps Churchill's and Roosevelt's most ambiguous, even hubristic geopolitical legacy. In 1946, the Americans proposed the so-called Baruch Plan for international control of atomic energy through a United Nations Commission. One historian called it emasculated internationalism, as it allowed the United States to remain the only nation capable of making an atomic bomb. How clever. Moreover, the proposals eliminated the Security Council veto on atomic matters, which gave the United States even more control because it was the only country that had the science. The Soviet Union opposed the plan. Churchill argued against it in his Fulton speech. After all, he wants a British bomb. And the Attlee government in Britain was unenthusiastic. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin said, "Let's forget the Baruch," meaning Baruch, "and get on with the fissile," which is one of the elements in the process of creating a nuclear fission. Anyways, pretty good quip. The message was clear. Great power equality and status now seem to depend upon developing an atomic bomb. That's 1945-46. Now, just read that one again. Great power equality and status now seem to depend upon developing an atomic bomb. When the Russians refused to accept the inspection requirements, it actually passed the United Nations, the plan, but became dormant. U.S. Congress and Harry Truman, either ignorant or dismissive of the Churchill-Roosevelt's agreements to share the atomic secret, put legislation, the McMahon Act, in effect that ended the wartime cooperation. The Anglo-American special relationship wobbled on its axis, though shared Cold War fears ultimately kept it alive. More significant, the extensive U.S. nuclear development and testing program quickly followed. The nuclear arms race was on. So here we are, in 2013. You count up the years, I don't do math. Here we are in 2013, still scrambling in vain to hold on to the atomic secret, even as membership in the nuclear club, that's one of those wonderful, not so wonderful, soft words that seems to legitimize nuclear weapons. It's not we're in the nuclear terrorist camp, or whatever you want to call it, destruction camp. We're in the nuclear club. We have a merit badge, and secret handshake, and all that. Anyway, membership in the nuclear club continues to grow. The Soviet Union joined in 1949. The British and the French soon followed. China, India, Pakistan, Israel have all come on board. North Korea agreed to close down its bomb-producing facilities, but only after it developed the ability to make a bomb. Iran, still knocking on the door, is almost sure to do the same. We're told there are still nuclear devices, bombs, scattered around in the former Soviet Empire. We're losing count of how many members there are now of the club. What's certain is that trying to keep that genie in the bottle is just a variation of the ostrich's head in the sand reaction to things it doesn't want to see. It was neither Mr. Churchill's nor Mr. Roosevelt's finest hour. Now, perhaps the reality that the bomb would be an unusable weapon after Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not apparent before both Churchill and Roosevelt were gone. After all, both seemed, though I'm not sure of this now, seemed to view the bomb as just a bigger bang, not a technological revolution. Yet Churchill, with his understanding of the historical past, knew very well that past super weapons, like the Dreadnought or the V-2 rocket, had not brought the possessor geopolitical security. Neither of them, Roosevelt or Churchill, feared a Soviet military attack in the immediate aftermath of war in Europe. Political is not the same as military, and they were not afraid of a Soviet attack, which of course nobody in the military was either, because the Soviet army was tired at best. Both knew full well that Stalin was making a full major effort to develop a Soviet A-bomb. So they were playing for the short term. Why? There was no short-term threat. Hubris seems the only answer. Niels Bohr was not the only one who expressed fears that an attempt to create and hold an atomic monopoly was doomed to failure, and that nationalism, 20th and I think 21st century so far, century's most powerful force, even more powerful than otherism, nationalism would create a new and potentially more dangerous arms race. Bohr suggested internationalization of atomic secrets. Others thought in terms of sharing. But Churchill and Roosevelt slammed the door shut on such thoughts, and did so in great secrecy. The ineffectiveness of nuclear leverage in geopolitics appeared even before the bombs were dropped on Japan. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the newly minted American President Harry Truman told Stalin of the atomic bomb, though he apparently without using those specific words. Stalin, who of course already knew about the weapon, seemed to brush it off, showing, and I quote, no special interest. That was, of course, a calculated response. In the words of Henry Kissinger, the written words of Henry Kissinger, he wasn't at the conference, by the end of the conference, it was clear that the atomic bomb had not made the Soviets more cooperative. So then, what danger in pursuing schemes for the internationalization and control of nuclear power and weapons? Had that become a reality when I think it was a possibility, we might not face the very real threat of non-state actors, terrorists and such, possessing nuclear weapons and devices. It was neither Mr. Churchill's nor Mr. Roosevelt's finest hour.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. That was a very enlightening and interesting talk, and we now know that we should really blame Roosevelt and Churchill for the disaster we are in at the moment.
On the nuclear stuff, they're the only ones I know who had a chance to do it differently. Nobody else could.
Good. That certainly demolishes the myth of Roosevelt and Churchill being superheroes. Let's open it for questions. There's one right over there.
You mentioned, if I understood you correctly, that Congress was not a part of the goings-on until like 1947.
That's right.
Looking at this, the Truman, Roosevelt era, from an organizational, organizational chart point of view, who was between the president and the Manhattan Project? Was it State Department, military?
No, the State Department was on the out. They didn't know really anything about it. It was handled mainly by Vannevar Bush and James Conant. Conant above Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush is getting down into the science level, though he was a military guy. And those, it was a separate channel, and it was in a silo. It was in a silo. Truman didn't know anything about it until he became president. Yeah. I mean, they didn't tell anybody, nor would I have if I were president. mean, it was much too secret at that time.
Very closely held. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, please.
You mentioned about how Stalin knew about the Manhattan Project, but what if Stalin also, advanced his research because the Germans, or there's the spies that the Germans were also inventing this new type of technology. Maybe it was more of the sphere of Germany than maybe the United States.
Well, I don't know of any document that gives that as something that was a motivation. We don't have a lot of detailed information on Stalin and nuclear weapons. David Holloway out at Stanford is the one who's done the most research on that, and I've used that pretty extensively, and he reads Russian and both of those things. I haven't heard of anything that would suggest that, except to say if there's anything that Stalin would have been cautious about is to make sure that the Germans weren't able to develop the weapon either. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't believe Stalin was asked to cooperate, in my knowledge, on the attack at Peenemünde, which was aimed at the heavy water that was being used in the initial stuff on the science. I don't believe the Russians were asked to cooperate on that, but I'd have to check that. It's a good question. One of the things on Stalin that's worth mentioning to you, around the time of, after the bombs were dropped on Japan, Stalin told Molotov that to cave into atomic diplomacy, he understood that they'll try to use this as leverage. He says, to cave into atomic diplomacy makes no sense. All right? If our enemies, let me get the words right. If the enemies use the bomb, we lose. If we cave in, we lose. So pay no attention and build our own bomb. Okay? Isn't that what the Iranians are saying?
Yeah.
Somebody. Anyway, you're the boss.
I just had a question. You said that FDR and Churchill were the only ones who really had this chance. But don't you think that Truman also had a chance to, because Stimson and Acheson both wrote memos after we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki proposing the internationalization of atomic energy information?
Yeah, but you're right, yes, except that the internationalization that they proposed really should have been called American monopolization, because it was fundamentally the Baruch Plan, which called for the United States to be the control. So the idea is that we were moral, just, and to be trusted by all, and we could do the bomb, and we could share nuclear energy and all of those good things, but we would control it. Well, give me a break. Nobody's going to buy it. Churchill didn't buy that.
My understanding had been that Stimson proposed that we impound all existing bombs, and everyone agreed to stop producing any more.
Right. Well, again, impounding the weapons is a great idea, and of course we were the only ones that had any. So if we had them, they were impounded in the United States because we're the good guys. And the second thing is that, again, keep in mind, Churchill wanted no part of that, because Churchill had decided pretty strongly that Britain had to have a bomb. Now, granted, he leaves office, but Attlee and the Labour government continued.
So even if Truman had made that decision, Churchill still...
And the last thing is, keep in mind when you're talking about Dean Acheson, that Dean Acheson is the man who, when challenged, Kaz can probably quote this chapter and verse, but when challenged by someone, why do we need to build up NSC 68? Why do we need to build up our armed forces? Why do we need to go through all of this military buildup? There's no threat. The Russians don't have the ability, this before they dropped the bomb, tested the bomb. The Russians don't have the ability to attack us and yada, okay? And Acheson gave a lecture to that person, in essence saying, great powers have to be great, and they have to have the ability to be great. And it refers, I think, to what I read before about if you're going to be one of the big boys, you've got to have a bomb. It's a status issue. That's Dean Acheson.
It still is the case, isn't it?
Huh?
It still is the case today.
That's what they think.
Yeah, exactly. So the danger year, I think, was 1954, that they expected a Soviet invasion round about that year, but not much before that. That at least was what the planner said. Mike, please, yeah.
You suggested in your talk that the real obstacle to internationalization of atomic weapons under Roosevelt and Churchill was their own personal hubris. And I wonder if another interpretation isn't possible. This interpretation would be that internationalization would only impose costs on the United States and Britain without bringing any benefits. Because after all, the benefits from an international regime would only accrue if all of the participants in that regime played by the rules, played honestly by the rules. And it's worth asking, from their point of view, whether they could expect Stalin to play by the rules. So the upside of such a scheme would be dubious, and the downside was clear. The downside would be that the whatever regime they came up with would put limits on British and American freedom of action. So no matter what scheme they could put together from 1944, 1945, had the prospect of imposing a lot of costs without really doing much good for the United States or British security.
Yeah, I flinch at the word costs because I thought that refers to money. You're talking about geopolitical costs.
Right.
I'm sure that had they been inclined to really try to develop some scheme for either the internationalization or the control, and actually you need both, but okay, of nuclear weapons, of atomic weapons, they would have had to balance those judgments. Sure they would. But when they rejected it, came at a time when Soviet, British, American relations were really good. I mean, you don't have Churchill turning his back on Roosevelt's post-war thinking, which is cooperation and develop. Give the communists time to become civilized people. Kind of that talk. Churchill doesn't do that until after Yalta. It's really Poland, I think, that changes his mind, the brutality of the Soviet actions in Poland. But anyhow, they reject cooperation with Stalin in 43 and in 44. And things are pretty good then. I don't think it was a geopolitical assessment in the sense you've used it, where there's this careful balancing. In fact, I don't think presidents very often go through careful balancing. I think political scientists do that a lot. Historians try to do that a lot. I don't think presidents do that much at all. And the more I think about that, the more I'm almost sure. But in this case, in their case, they weren't even inclined to go in that direction at the times when, if they had said, let's share the secret but not the weaponry with Stalin, and say, these are the things that we can bring to the table in a post-war cooperative thing. Unbeknownst to them, Stalin was hoping that would happen, not in order to get his hands on the bomb, no. He was really hoping for close post-war cooperation in 43 and 44 because he was deeply concerned that his country was so devastated. We got estimates now, 30 million. Solid estimates from Russian scholars who were doing good work on that stuff. Graves, checking graves, it's incredible. Anyway, yeah. He was pretty well convinced that his country was so devastated that he was afraid the West would roll over on him. So a lot of paranoia. So all I'm trying to say is Stalin hoped that there would be cooperation with those kinds of things in 43, 44. But
did Stalin ever ask Roosevelt for information, scientific information on the bomb?
No, and why not?
Yeah.
It's very easy. Why? If Stalin asked for the information, he would be revealing that he had spies in the Manhattan Project. And that he didn't want to lose unless the Americans came and said, see, did he know that he knew that he knew that he knew?
Exactly.
We're right back to it.
I'm sure Stalin knew that Roosevelt knew about his espionage.
I'm sure he did too, but he wasn't going to mention it. So, I mean, it's a crazy thing.
Right, thank you. The lady over there, you had a question?
Well, I was going to ask about the influence of the spies, because much later in the 50s, in the McCarthy era, the Rosenbergs and that whole crew. So you've sort of hinted, has your research really given definitive answers to the influence of the spy?
Not my research, but luckily the research of others. It's pretty clear that, well, for example, it's pretty clear that the Rosenbergs, Ethel more than Julius, were spies, no question, delivering stuff, and they were being asked for information. They were agents under some degree of control. A lot of the other so-called spies back there were people who thought that their their wisdom was greater than the wisdom of other people. It may have been, but Hiss, for example, and Parry Dexter White. If that's kind of a hard one to figure out what went on. So number one, and Green. What was the other? Greenglass.
Fuchs.
Huh?
Fuchs.
Well, Fuchs is not an American, but Fuchs was Fuchs was there. But it's pretty clear from what I've read from other people's research on the science that these people were not able to deliver the degree of science and technology that would have just handed the bomb to the Russians. Russian ability to produce a bomb, my understanding, it came particularly from captured German scientists. That's where a lot of it came from at the end of the war. They beat us to some of the German scientists. What was the name of the project we had that suddenly cleansed them of Nazism? Because
the Werner von Braun.
Yeah. Well, but no, we went after German nuclear scientists. It's just been in the papers. I can't remember the name of the code name. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about.
The closed-mouth archivists that you referred to early on. What umbrella are they under? Are they under the military or the?
That's a complicated question. It like most archives, no nation puts all its archives that I know of, no major nation, in one place. The Brits have the National Archive now. We have the National Archive. The fact is that archives are dependent upon the willingness of agencies to turn over their records. And all the executive order, I'll talk about this country, I mean, I've been wrapped up with this one for 15 years. In this country, there are all kinds of directives about turning over classified information, and there are all kinds of loopholes and ways for agencies to say, no, we can't do that yet. Atomic Energy Commission, and now it's in the Department of Energy, was one of the major ones who wouldn't give anything. And they went back and reclassified stuff that had been printed and published. So, but I think that the same thing in Russia. The diplomatic archives have been opened up better than most, and as I mentioned, the Wartime Defense Committee, which is it's a Russian institution of military and civilian, but their stuff has been opened up. But it depends on the agency.
So there's a number of different.
Yeah. There's no simple centralized
Thank you.
thing.
Lady over there, please.
I'm not sure I'll ask this question very clearly, but as an undergraduate here in the mid-70s, mutual assured destructiveness, I must have written 1,000 papers on that, heard that word more times than I can count, or phrase, sorry. Were there any, going back to this period of time, was there any embryonic sort of back and forth discussions kind of along that line? We'll share information with this country, Russia, but no, we don't trust them that, they won't kill us, if they won't try to kill us, we won't try to kill them. Was there any kind of beginnings of that sort of idea that, we won't kill each other because we can't afford to?
I can't, my guess is there were some people who chatted about things like that, but it was always at the chat level. I don't know of wonderfully deep memos of conversations that would tell us how people were thinking about that. I think that the nuclear thing fell under two elements. One is it was hugely secret within the government, so you didn't have general discussions of the usual political advisors. The State Department was completely out of the loop. Completely out of the loop. The other thing is that as early as 1942, late 42 or 43, I'd have to go check it, Roosevelt is telling one of the State Department committees on post-war affairs, he says, he meets with them regularly, and he's saying to them, I really don't know what the heck we're going to do with the Russians. I don't know how to handle the Russians. So I look at those words, and I don't see any plan, no written thing, and then I look at what he did. And day after day, he kept extending, if you can call it an olive branch, to the Russians because he wanted to create an atmosphere of cooperation and trust. But he held back on the nuclear, on the atomic secret. So I'm saying to myself, he must have had a debate in his head. Maybe he talked to Harry Hopkins, but Hopkins never mentioned it. And maybe he talked to Daisy Suckley, I don't know. But he seems to have had a debate in his head about what's the wise thing to do, and I think the wise thing was to not let the Russians have it too quickly. Sorry to be vague.
Do you want to come in, Miles, briefly?
Sure. I'm wondering, when the United States used the atomic bomb against Japan, they used a weapon that they developed in secret and used it without warning. Did that decision have an impact on prospects for negotiating international control of nuclear weapons?
That's too speculative. I mean, I can only guess. I don't think the ball game was over then. I mean, one person asked, could Truman have done it? If Truman had a different attitude, I think possibly something could have been done, particularly in terms of sharing. Because what the British backed the British off was that they wanted to have their status symbol as well, and I'm sure Stalin did. So if someone in the American government had been able to push the notion of sharing with proper controls and that raises the balancing issue that you talked about. No question, it's an issue. But I don't know of any evidence of any such discussions. The problem is that discussions about the bomb, even then, were in a silo. And so I just don't. Do I think we have all the information? No. Do we have a lot of it? I think so.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, listening to you talk about seems like your talk was mainly premised on the idea that Roosevelt and Churchill had this opportunity to stop this nascent atomic or nuclear proliferation. They lost that opportunity. And I keep coming back, and some other people mentioned the subject of espionage. And as you mentioned, Roosevelt was aware that the Manhattan Project was infiltrated. Stalin was aware. And I'm almost wondering, I mean, in hindsight, of course, this is the curse of hindsight, but when you think about all this kind of stuff, there is a certain inevitability to all of it. And I'm almost wondering if Roosevelt and Churchill didn't feel that there was also an inevitability to this. They knew that Stalin was getting this information, and perhaps they suspected or assumed that it would only be a matter of time before the quantity and quality of that information got better. So I'm just wondering, and if there's anything to that, I think that maybe speaks to the real influence of espionage here at the beginning of the Cold War. Because lots of times espionage is looked at as this kind of almost amusing sideshow. You know.
Historians don't look at it of World War II and the Cold War that way at all anymore, and haven't for some time now. But what you just said only bears out what I just talked about, because whether the cause is espionage or speculation or whatever, the fact is that they do not seem to have considered the process of that there are no secrets. If two people know about it, there's no secret left. Okay? Granted, they probably counted on the fact that the technology was difficult. And note, one of the ways they tried to control atomic weapons right away was gain control of uranium supplies. That soon proved impossible, but there were attempts. And when I say they, no, I don't mean Churchill and Roosevelt here. I'm talking about the two governments tried to do that. So did Stalin. But sure, whether maybe espionage played a role, maybe they thought of it. I never read them talking that way, but yeah, they should have known that this secret. Please tell me a technological secret in the history of the world that's ever been kept a secret. Name one. Oh, well, you wouldn't know it because it's still a secret. Right? Trick question. Go ahead.
So, on this exact point, I started by thinking about your connections to the present and Iran, and where these the parallels kind of seem to break down a little bit in regards to the level of secrecy, because you think you very helpfully distinguish between the science and other aspects of the planning, but at some point, as you said, the science genie comes out of the bottle. It is no longer a secret. So the thing that, and first of all, the first question is, at what point would you say that was basically common knowledge how to build an A-bomb?
When did that article get published in the Wisconsin journal, some science journal out of the University of Wisconsin? Got published, I think, in the 50s, early 50s. It was published, public stuff. It was out there. You can still find copies. Now they're classified.
Right.
It's illegal to own the copy of a published article, which somehow seems to be a violation of common sense, but that's not in the Constitution.
But somehow since that
so
point,
it's
though,
at least to the 50s, the nuclear secret is out there in that sense.
and
The
yet, and so
technology
since that
is not.
point, however, you know, yes, it's a large club, and we're starting to lose track, but we're only starting to lose track of the members. There's still, it's not something that everybody has, right? There are fairly some significant world powers that
Okay.
don't have atomic weapons. How do you, you know, I'm persuaded that Roosevelt and Churchill failed, but their failure seems to have an expiration date when it happened anyway. So how do we explain, you know, what happens after them and why
Much
there's
to
still...
explain. The part of it relates to your own self-image of what kind of power you want to exercise. The Brazilians, for example, who probably have the scientific knowledge, okay, and probably have access to uranium, have made a conscious governmental decision that's been stuck down. Absolutely not. We're not going there. So, you know, sometimes there are governments that make those choices. Maybe they don't, they've decided they want to play a regional role rather than the other. I can't judge that. I'm no expert on why other nations large enough to build that kind of a project, put it together, why they've done it. The Chinese have a bomb. I included them in this. But I can't answer that. We know the South Africans could have built a bomb. Okay? Who else is on the list of people? India, Pakistan had it.
Japan, Germany.
Yeah, the Germans were not permitted.
So there were other, you know, other
Yeah.
forces.
So I mean, there is an element of culture, of that will play a role in the decision-making process, and maybe those people made a cost-benefit analysis and said, Brazil might have said, we don't need the bomb because at least in the foreseeable future, the Americans will save us from anything that's really that bad in this Western Hemisphere. I don't know.
We need to give some.
But I have to look at their records that I have.
We need to give some credit to the Ukraine and Kazakhstan. It's a former, new states after the breakup of the Soviet Union who renounced or gave back the weapons on their territory.
Better say they gave them back.
Yeah.
Because
But let me ask that. Let me pick up on this last question. I know you are a historian, but the present situation is of interest. So, what is the future of the Iranian nuclear weapon, of the North Korean weapons nuclear system? They're programmed. How speculate a little bit?
I have no idea the science of their programs. I'm not a scientist. I do think that we are foolish not to develop a sharing attitude. Even Kim Il-sung, or whatever the baby up there is now, he seems a little bit less nuts than his father, but he's an unstable personality. But I don't see any solution except to go to the Iranians and say, all right, well, here's the deal. We'll give you all the technology. If you build a bomb, we're screwed. But this technology will help you make use of the nuclear technology for what you need it for energy production and all the things. I don't see any solution. Problem is, they don't trust us now. They're convinced, just as Stalin became convinced about us and we became convinced about Stalin, that he wants to conquer us. So they want to conquer us, so we want to conquer them. So we built up this horrible wall of mutual fear. That's why I think Roosevelt and Churchill were the only ones who had a chance, because they fought that way at a time when cooperation with the Soviet Union, we now know, hindsight helps sometimes, was something Stalin wanted.
So we should accept Iran having a nuclear weapon?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That wouldn't be dangerous?
No,
the government claims?
drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Honestly, I mean, what choice do we have, for goodness sake? We don't have any choice. And I don't mean choice out of fear. I mean just choice out of common sense. They're going to have a bomb.
The Israelis don't seem to like it.
Israelis don't like a lot of things. I mean, I understand why. If I lived in Israel, I'd feel the same way, but I don't know what choice we have. Unless you have one. You have a choice?
No, but I don't want to see an armaments race in the Middle East either.
Neither do I.
Couldn't both those nations' facilities get a visit from a Tomahawk cruise missile? JDAM?
No. The answer is no. It's a good question. The answer is flat out no, because what little I do know about the Iranian facilities is they had built research bunkers and stuff way down below the ability of any kind of nuclear bomb. Even
Sure.
the dam buster, what are the you know, they like
Penetrating bombs.
Thank you. The bunker busters are, according to what I've read,
Sure.
can't get even enough. So.
That would be prudent on their part.
Do you think we still have a chance of regaining that trust if we went about it in a more unconventional way? So if we were to try to use a third party like China or maybe even Russia now, like with this new pivot to the Pacific, if we were to say that that's, well, maybe not say it not in the open, but behind closed doors with China, say, hey, we want to work with you to collaborate with them, right?
There are, if we sat here for an hour and a half with a six-pack apiece, we could come up with a dozen different démarches, a dozen different ways to conduct diplomacy without without total humiliation, all right? And be able to get it through. It would take time, but that's the key thing. We can find lots of methods. It's going to take, I would say, it would take a minimum of a decade of change policy to begin to convince the Iranians that to move in the right direction. Because part of their structure has to do with some religious beliefs that they're very frightened about being threatened. You know, they're a minority Islamic sect in an Islamic world that hates them. So that the minute we go away, they've got the Shias out there. So it's a very difficult social structure. But I personally, I don't see what choice we have. Otherwise, we just make ourselves look silly.
From the Iranian point of view, why should Britain and France and the United States have a nuclear bomb?
And not them.
That's perfectly okay, but Iran not. So from their point of view, one can understand it. From a Western point of view, it's still a little disconcerting. I think we won't find the solution tonight. Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. Thanks for coming here.